Notebook on Cities and Culture's Korea Tour is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, David Hayes, and Polar Inertia Journal, an outlet for artists and researchers documenting the urban condition at polarinertia.com. Roughly how much of Korean life do you think you can come to understand in advance of coming to Korea by watching Hong Sangsoo movies?
Hong Sangsoo is one of the better directors if you want to learn about, I think, everyday Korean life. He won't tell you anything about the history of Korea. He won't tell you anything about maybe the politics specifically, but he will tell you a lot about the everyday social interactions, especially, but I mean, it is amongst a very small group, sort of an intellectual class, if you will, of university students, professors, and artists in Korea. But I think general Korean audiences tend to recognize a lot of the same social interactions that happen in Hong Sangsoo films. So yeah, I think there is a fair amount you can learn, even though I'm curious because I did not encounter Hong Sangsoo films until I came to Korea.
Oh, you were here first?
Yeah, I was here first. So if I watched the films outside of living in Korea, I'm not sure what my experience would have been. If I would have just said, "Ben, this is too strange to really understand," or if I would have, or if what would have interested me in the culture. I'm not sure.
This is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from Korea, the land of Hong Sangsoo, specifically in Seoul, the city where several of his movies take place, in Garosu-gil, talking to Marc Raymond. He is an assistant professor at Kangwoon University. He is the author of the book Hollywood's New Yorker, The Making of Martin Scorsese, and he's written extensively about Korean cinema, especially about Hong Sangsoo. And when we first met, it was in Seattle a few months ago at a cinema studies conference where he was presenting a paper, in fact, on Hong Sangsoo. And, you know, the connection between Scorsese and Hong Sangsoo is not obvious, but I remember watching a DVD of Hong Sang-soo's Woman is the Future of Man, where Scorsese shows up unexpectedly before it plays and talks about nothing but how good the movie is, how much he loves this movie. And, I mean, I'm in agreement with him about Hong Sangsoo in general, but it can't be a coincidence you've written so much about both these directors, can it?
I'm not sure. It could be, but I'm wondering if there is something to those two directors in terms of their, I guess their very specific look at kind of subcultures, if you will, or they're very, Scorsese, what attracted me to Scorsese's films early on was how specific and real those characters felt that he wrote, that he made his early films about, especially Mean Streets. Mean Streets was the film that I still love the most of all Scorsese's films, the film I've written about the most. And so I think you could probably see a connection with Hong Sangsoo, even though they are very different directors in terms of their temperament, in terms of their style. But there is perhaps something uniting them in that sort of sociological detail, if you will.
Now, it seems that Hong Sangsoo has a place in Korean cinema as like the square peg, if you will, like the one who doesn't quite fit into Korean cinema within the country. He's well received outside of it. And Martin Scorsese, you say the name and he's thought of as this beloved director, very well known. He's thought of almost offhand as a very mainstream director, but he's not a mainstream director, is he? He's a well-known, famous director, but not necessarily a mainstream, by-the-book filmmaker, is he?
I don't think so. I mean, his whole reputation is built on this weird dichotomy between being an outsider but yet also working in Hollywood at the same time. Like he's, if you read a lot of writing about Scorsese or interviews Scorsese gives, he constantly does talk about this idea of being an outsider and of being. And in his History of American Cinema documentary, for example, he has a segment on the director as a smuggler, as like bringing in secret meetings underneath the radar. And I think he identifies with that himself. I think he sees himself as something of a smuggler himself. But I do think it's a little bit different from Hong's relationship to the Korean industry, since he has never really achieved that kind of significance, even though it's interesting though, because I think as many Korean, maybe more Koreans would know who Hong Sangsoo is than Americans would know who Martin Scorsese is. But I think that speaks more to Korean nationalism, actually, like that Koreans, because Hong Sangsoo has been a successful director in film festivals, and his name just gets circulated, so people who've never seen his films still might know the name more than in America, perhaps.
He's that most beloved Korean thing, a Korean who has become famous in the outside world. In Europe, in America, like, this is one of those codes Koreans of every kind try to crack, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely, if you look back at film festivals, just to give the example I know best, back in the 1980s, there weren't really any Korean films at festivals. There was no real Korean presence on an international stage. That really doesn't start to happen until the 1990s. And Hong becomes one of the people who becomes one of the most successful of the Korean directors on that festival circuit, even though he hasn't necessarily won huge awards. He's never won the main award at Cannes, for example, or at Venice, but he has constantly played at these festivals, won some awards, and just it become kind of a standard on the festival circuit. If the new Hong Sangsoo movie gets made, it's probably going to play at these festivals.
Right, he has a sort of a permanent position like Wes Anderson has in the Criterion Collection, and I would hope that one day Hong Sangsoo will get a regular appointment in Criterion releases. You think it can happen?
I think so, yeah. I really think Hong Sangsoo will eventually make it into that kind of area. I mean, Korean cinema itself is just starting to break into the Criterion Collection, which probably speaks to something of the way the Criterion Collection operates, I think, where it takes a bit of time for things to get established before they get in.
Wait and see.
Yeah. So there's Secret Sunshine, the Yi Chang-dong film, and then there's The Housemaid that's now part of the collection. I think those are the only two, I believe, at this point. So, but I think Hong Sangsoo will eventually, and because he makes so many films, I think maybe something like those Eclipse sets would be perfect for him, right? Like you could package 5 or 6 early or mid or period Hong Sangsoo films and release them in that way. So I wouldn't be surprised if that happens in the near future.
Now, everybody, I think, who listens to the show knows what a Martin Scorsese movie is, but those who've never seen a Hong Sangsoo movie, maybe who have a little familiarity with Korean cinema, how would you describe to them what a Hong Sangsoo movie is?
Well, a Hong Sangsoo movie will almost always consist of a lead character who is some kind of artist. If you watch a Hong Sangsoo film from the second half of his career, he'll probably definitely be a film director / film professor. That's most likely, or maybe a film student. The earlier work tends to be, there might be writers, there might be painters, but an artist of some kind. And the plot of the film, as it is, will be basically that character's relationships, both romantic and friendships that he has with people in his immediate circle. And the films do tend to be very talky, right? Which is maybe why they're often not seen as the kind of very formally adventurous art cinema that they kind of are, actually. If you look at them, their form is quite challenging, but there is a lot of dialogue that kind of covers up that very formal style.
It's two forms we don't see collide much in America. Is it the talking movie, the relationship movie, the talky relationship movie, and the sort of structurally innovative, almost rigorous, I don't want to say art film, and it's not experimental, but how would you describe the way he structures his movies? How is it different? And do you have to pay hard attention to notice that he's being creative in that way, or not?
I think you do have to pay attention for example, the things he does with his narrative form. In terms of his style, just the way the films look, they're kind of deceptive. You kind of just say, oh, it's just a two-shot of two characters talking, and he's just letting the scene play out. But actually, there is quite a bit of, we would say, quite a bit of stylistic kind of daring, I would even say, in his films, because like I said, you really do have to pay attention to what's kind of happening between the characters. He also will set up these really elaborate group shots where there's 5 or 6 people around a table, and it's all about the way in which they're interacting. And it's obviously a very heavily choreographed kind of thing, even though it feels very naturalistic. So there's that kind of style to his work. So he has this kind of combination of almost improvisational kind of style. It's not, but Hong has kind of known for writing the dialogue the night before and then coming to set, and then so it can feel very loose, but there is a structure clearly to what he's doing, because there's too many kind of repetitions and things like that happening.
And he's known for a sort of method whereby he drinks and smokes a lot with his actors as well, right?
Yeah, there is this kind of, the rehearsal period, if you will, is just simply sitting around, talking, drinking. And of course, that's what the characters do often in the films as well. There's a lot of people sitting around tables and talking and drinking. And so, and that is something that I think we see in Korean culture as well. There is this drinking culture, of this of people kind of gathering around and having these kind of long sort of conversations. And I think his films get into that. And so they, but like you mentioned, they're very different than, let's say, the works of like a Woody Allen, who does a lot of long takes as well and gives actors his freedom, but they lack that kind of formal rigor, the kind of, I think you could watch a Hong Sangsoo film and actually be kind of distanced by the style, which I think he might actually be wanting you to do to some extent. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
How long were you in Korea before you encountered Hong Sangsoo films?
I had moved back to Korea. I had lived in Korea for a year. Did not encounter his films at that time. First heard about his work through actually a book by David Bordwell that talking about. It's called Figures Traced in Light, and it talks about mise-en-scène and long-take approaches to staging action. And he mentions a scene from The Virgin Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors in that book.
Maybe the most acclaimed Hong Sangsoo movie.
I think so. Certainly one of the handful of the most acclaimed. And and after sort of reading that little analysis, I kind of, Hong Sangsoo's name kind of registered for me for the first time. But I didn't actually encounter his films until I had moved back to Korea. And I was back here maybe 4 or 5 months. And in the process of finishing my dissertation on Martin Scorsese, needed something to get away from that. And so I actually started a blog on Korean cinema. And I watched some of Hong's DVDs, wrote about just short entries on them. And that kind of began my interest in his films. And then I saw his film Night and Day at the Jeonju Festival in 2008. First time seeing a Hong Sangsoo film with an audience, which gave me a different appreciation. Maybe
an all-Korean audience, too.
Yes, an all-Korean audience, and an audience that really appreciated the film, actually. They laughed a lot. There was a pretty big crowd. So it sort of showed me how, and I think maybe that was also a turn in Hong's work where his films became more comedic. I think his earlier films are a bit darker in their themes and their subject matter. Since then, I mean, there's still darkness there for sure, but they do play a bit more as almost comedy of manners, let's say, or
When did you find out Scorsese was a fan? Was that a surreal moment when you found that out?
It was, actually. I was going through... I was doing kind of a chapter on Scorsese kind of as a film critic for my book, and I came across these introductions he did to the one you mentioned about To Woman Who's a Future Man, and I kind of discovered that Scorsese had this kind of interest in Hong Sangsoo. As you might remember, it's a pretty short introduction, and he hasn't really written much more about it. So I know that he's a fan, but I haven't really... there isn't a ton on how, what Scorsese's main interest is or what sort of brought him to Hong Sangsoo. But it's sort of interesting. I mean, in his most recent film, Scorsese is actually mentioned in a dialogue scene where there's a director who mentions he's talking to Martin Scorsese on the phone, or a scholar, I should say. And so, yeah, it's a curious kind of connection, but one that was kind of surprising for sure.
So when you first encountered, as we say, Hong Sang-soo's movies while in Korea, did you see them and think, oh, yes, this is the country that I've spent my time in. This is it. This is the real reflection of Korea.
I think so. I mean, I think you do get an appreciation watching Hong's films that he's getting at something. It's a curious effect he's able to achieve because the films are in some ways very formal, very stylized, especially those early films like The Virgin Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors has this split structure where he's seemingly replaying scenes, but you're not sure if he actually is replaying them or if it's a different time. But there's all it's this heavily formalized, structured work. But yet the interactions between the characters, I think, really does. I think if you've lived in Korea for a period of time, you kind of recognize the way the characters relate to each other. The kind of one of my favorite moments in Hong's movies is he did a short film for the Jeonju digital project back in 2008. And a film called Lost in the Mountains was his short film, 35 minutes short. And at the end of that film, a character finally kind of breaks protocol and just sort of calls everybody on what she really thinks of them and just leaves. And the moment has such power because that's something Koreans just do not do very often, right? That the idea of actually, going against people who are, older than you, more respected than you, the kind of social rules usually don't break down to that extent, and Hong plays with that in an interesting way. He recognizes those rules, plays with them, but allows moments where they do break down eventually, especially with alcohol involved and so forth.
Yes, you mentioned alcohol. Some people who are not that familiar with his movies will say he always makes the same movie. It's always there's this central shot with a bunch of people huddled around a table with empty bottle of soju after empty bottle of soju, the stack of green bottles. But, I mean, you don't realize, if you're not familiar with Korean culture, how important it is to empty those soju bottles. Like, if you don't drink with somebody in Korea, they don't really trust you, do they?
Yeah, there's that definite sort of obligation, almost like social obligation that you do have to drink, and that kind of becomes ingrained, kind of almost in the culture, so that even if you don't have to, you just do it because that's what you do, right? That's what people do, is just go out and drink massive sort of amounts of alcohol. And yeah, for somebody who doesn't know that about Korean culture, it might seem like all the characters are alcoholics, but they're really not. They're or maybe unless the whole country is that they're fair.
No one is that. No one is.
Yeah, they're fairly within the norms of that kind of culture. So yeah, there is that the sense, and then it's striking. Like when, for example, at the conference we talked about where we met. I did a presentation. I had a lot of stills that I showed. And I was kind of showing the presentation to my wife, just sort of preparing to make sure there was enough time. And she kind of noticed, wow, there's like soju bottles everywhere, every shot. And it's like they're all the same. And I'm like, yeah, when you see them, like, even though they're like 15 different films, they all kind of do almost seem to blend together into one master kind of text. Right?
One long drinking binge. Now, your wife is Korean. What does she think of Hong Sangsoo films? Has she seen many of them?
Yeah, she's seen, I believe, 3 or 4 at least that we saw in the theater. She was with me for the night and day screening in Jeonju. The film, Like You Know It All, played here, and we went to see that. We've seen she's seen a number of films, and she enjoys them. She finds them interesting. She laughs a lot. She laughs at things I don't laugh at because I don't quite get maybe the context, or the translation's not good enough. I can't really pick up on the humor.
What's an example of something she's found hilarious that you were just kind of staring at, wondering, should I be laughing? Is it always just a dialogue joke? Or?
Not always. Sometimes it's some of the cameos in the films that I don't recognize. For example, at the end of the film, Like You Know It All, there's a cameo from the actor who I did not know at the time, and whose name is actually now escaping me.
Yes, I
Sarah the Berlin File, which was out last year.
Famous guy.
Yeah. And he's a very famous actor, but he's got this little tiny cameo near the end of the film, and when he comes on the screen, the whole audience actually starts laughing. And it was, but I did not recognize the actor at the time. So I was, just got that kind of thing lost. And there are examples, too, of sometimes there is dialogue that simply doesn't quite and it's not even that it's the dialogue, it's more maybe the delivery. There's a sort of subtlety in the delivery that I do not quite get. Like there's a scene in the film Oki's Movie where a film director is having a conversation with this photographer he's met, and he mentions to her that he's a film director, but it's just the delivery of the line is the humor. And the first time I saw it, I didn't quite get it, but then when I watched it again, I remembered, and I'm like, oh, I can kind of see now, just there's something about the way he delivers that line that's just kind of funny.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's the more Korean I learn, the more I laugh. And it's funny because his movies, I somehow understand the language more. Probably a Korean friend said to me, because there's so many awkward pauses, it gives me time to, like, when somebody makes a faux pas and everybody's silent at the table for a bit, I can then process the language. They don't just go rapid fire. But, you know, these men in Hong Sangsoo movies, much is made of them. They're drinking, they're womanizing, they're bragging, even if they're professors, filmmakers, artists, anything. They're all sort of, we would consider them in the West pretty badly behaved, I think. But what do you think men behaving badly is a necessary theme in Hong's work?
I think so, but I think it's kind of evolving, which is what's nice about, I think, the work. I think the earlier films are more kind of straight up critiques of Korean masculinity, and especially kind of ideas around the idealism of Korean men, that they're stuck in this kind of, okay, everything has to be this way, and if it's not, I can't deal with it, the lack of flexibility. And I think he's really, and I think he's kind of talked about in interviews where he's recognized that in himself when he was younger, and he's trying to work through those things in the movies. But I think there is a point where he's kind of worked that theme out, and he's kind of starting to, the men aren't necessarily behaving any better, but maybe they are getting a bit more self-awareness. They're not maybe as consumed with idealism as in the past, but now they're maybe dealing with different issues, which is, like, for example, one thing Hong's work has started to really explore is this, the male characters tend to be split a bit more between the older male and the younger male, like the older professor and the student. And I think Hong is working out his own kind of, now I'm this person, but I used to be this person. How do I, what's in between, or how to,
And he is a professor too, right? He teaches, and that's something I didn't know until I heard you talk about that on the New Korean Cinema podcast. I guess it would have been obvious given how much he talks about, how much he writes about professors in his movies. But do you have any sense of his identity as a teacher?
I'm not really. It's hard to say. I don't really know much about his. I've never been able to interview like a student of his or anything like that. But I think it's he's very much a professor of filmmaking, right? So he teaches students kind of like, I think Oki's Movie is a really good example probably of the type of thing he does, right? Which is meet with students, critique their work. That's kind of, especially as a very famous director in Korea, like within the Korean film industry, I think a lot of people just want to listen to what Hong has to say and listen to what his critiques of their work and his advice. So I think he does play very much what we would consider a mentor kind of role. So I don't think he's a traditional scholar. I don't think he writes about Korean cinema or Korea or film. I think he's really very much about trying to teach students, how to be filmmakers, how to be writers, perhaps. And I think, it's interesting to look back at Hong's an interview Hong did like way back in 1998, where he talks about, and he was already teaching at that point, and he sort of is interested in kind of the way in which teaching kind of grounds him in some way. So I think that's kind of important to his work, where at least as somebody who's still teaching and not just directing, he does have a way in, like, this is kind of the real world, quote unquote, that he's dealing with in his movies, and that's why maybe it's becomes more and more his subject, right? As he's run out of things maybe from his younger days, now this is what he's writing about, is his students and their experiences and his experience as their kind of mentor, perhaps.
Apart from his critique of Korean manhood, which he used to engage in quite vociferously, it's rarely discussed, but it seems to me he critiques Korean women equally, even though the characters seem to be less. His women characters seem to be less abjectly, terribly behaved. But at the same time, Hong Sangsoo's women, if the men are too idealistic and that cripples them, the women seem to be not idealistic enough. If anything, there seems to be they behave, but not with any central core to their behavior. It's like when you hear about a serial killer, and people always say, like, I feel like he would have said anything or done anything given the situation. His behavior was entirely contextual. The women seem to be similarly scary to me in his movies sometimes. Like they seem like real characters, but they also that they would do anything given, like, it's a rainy day in Korea. It seems like I don't know, do you find the women scary in his movies at any moment like I do?
I don't think I find them scary, but I mean, I definitely get what you're getting at. I mean,
the nihilism that they have.
Yeah, there is like, I see it more. Maybe I definitely identify more with the female characters in his movies than with the men. But at the same time, I agree they are not ideal. They're not characters who you want to necessarily hold up as paragons in any way. But they are. I just find them. I think the films that center around women to me are the more interesting films, at least. And
the more recent ones, then.
Recent ones, and even the earlier ones. I'm not a huge fan of the film Turning Gate, which is one of his earlier films, and partly is that there is no female lead really to grab onto. It really is a film about this male character, and it just becomes a little dull to me as a result. The women tend to give a bit more of the energy to the film, and maybe it is because they are. Maybe it is that streak of nihilism in the women, the idea that they do. But I think it is partly a practical kind of necessity that they are dealing with this patriarchal culture, and they almost have to, and they're sort of adapting to it, right? And so you might say maybe Hong Sangsoo gives Korean society the women they deserve, kind of thing, right?
Yes, it makes me glad to be an outsider in Korea, because it's a good example of this. I mean, I'm fascinated by the society in his movies, and I'm glad to participate in it when I can, but I'm glad that I'm clearly an outsider and will never join. I'll probably live in Korea within a few years, and I feel like it's been good preparation to watch his movies. And do you feel like from all your time living in Korea, I mean, do Hong Sang-soo's criticisms hit the mark? Do you think the maybe objections you can draw out of his movies to Korean society? Do you see why a Korean would be frustrated in the way that he may be frustrated?
Yeah, I think so. I think there is a lot of. I think the audience reaction to his films is like the ones that I've experienced in Korea, where I think the audiences, again, for the most part, they've been festival audiences, but not exclusively. There was one. I did watch one of his films with a more general audience, and I think the humor, like the fact that why they laugh so much, is the humor is kind of very dark, actually, in many ways. And I think it is, like I said, kind of a comedy of manners. I think he really is critiquing some of the aspects of Korean society that I think frustrated many Koreans, right? That they almost cannot break free of, but they recognize how kind of destructive or how these things are. And I think humor, like kind of darker comedies in all cultures do that to some extent. That's kind of the purpose they're serving, is to point out how ridiculous these things that we nevertheless still do, right? We can't quite break out. I mean, if it wasn't an issue, the comedy wouldn't really have any bite to it. The fact that it has, that it's recognizable and that it's still a problem, I think, is what gives the films their interest. And that's why I actually think, although Hong doesn't really deal with politics, he's sometimes called an apolitical director often. I don't really see that unless you want to restrict politics simply to, who votes for who. I mean, I think if you look at the social critique that's there, I think there's a lot in those films. from that perspective.
It must contribute to this that he's, for lack of a better word, an international Korean. I mean, he was, of course, born here, but he was educated elsewhere, even in America, and has lived all over the place, from what I understand. And, in Japan, I noticed a pretty stark divide between Japanese people who had been abroad and the ones who hadn't. There was sort of an international Japanese person and then a non-international one, I would imagine, say, by definition, your wife is a sort of internationalist Korean, and I would guess the Koreans you were among are the international types, yes?
Yeah, I think so. Most of the, even my students are often, because I teach in English, I don't teach in Korean, so my media studies students will tend to be, a fair number of them have studied abroad, or they have, at least, they have a higher level of English, so they have some more familiarity with culture outside of Korea. So, yeah, so that is, and I think that is definitely a factor in how Hong views Korean society, right, and why. And it's interesting. I mean, Hong has always been when he's been asked in interviews about these kind of questions. There is a certain not defensiveness necessarily, but I think he really does see himself as a Korean director. Though I think he does see himself as, and when he gets accused of making films not for Korean audiences but for international audiences, he says, "Well, no, there's way more Koreans will still see my movies than from any other country, or probably combined, right?" So he said, so he does still feel there is that kind of connection, but at the same time, I think he has there is kind of a shift in his work though and he's even kind of admitted that he has gotten less concerned maybe with the language that he was in his earlier films. That's why his later films are a bit easier to translate apparently, and they're a little easier to understand. I think if you go back, you watch something like The Day a Pig Fell in the Well, that's a very difficult film for outsiders to understand at the language level, right? It's there's a lot of slang, there's a lot of really difficult Korean, very specific, and I think he has tried to maybe eliminate that, maybe with an eye on the fact that he wants the films to be a bit more easily understood outside of the country. But
what does it mean then that in Darunara I saw, in another country, he cast Isabelle Huppert, the darling of the international independent directors, and shot half the thing in English at least? Well,
that's I think that film was really the culmination of something I had been noticing in Hong's work, actually, which is this interest in foreignness. There definitely is that interest in his in his films. It goes back. I mean, the most notable example is there's a scene in Woman on the Beach where the female character talks about living in Germany for a number of years and having relationships with these German men, and it really disturbs the two Korean guys greatly in different ways. Right? One guy doesn't even want to hear about it. The other guy wants to hear about it, but then when he hears about it, it bothers him for the rest of the movie. And there is that, and I think that's the beginning of these. And then, of course, Night and Day is set in Paris, even though there's very little English or French in the movie. It's all set. It's one of the jokes of the movie is that even though he's in Paris, all of his interactions are with other Koreans, right, with expats, right?
When he speaks to a foreigner, it's in very bad English, too, not French.
Right. Yeah, and almost, and most of the encounters of foreigners have almost a weirdly sinister kind of vibe to them. And so I think he had been working toward, and so I think In Another Country comes out of, is the full expression of that, which is how to, let's make a film in Korea, but with dealing with the experience of foreigners living in Korea. And I think one of the things that film gets really right is that interaction. That's one of those scenes as well, that if you're a foreigner who's lived in Korea, you will really immediately understand the interactions that Isabelle Huppert's character has in that movie. They feel very true to people's experiences.
Now, when did you first come to Korea and why?
I first came to Korea back in 2000. I stayed here for 1 year. I came really because I needed something to do between my master's and my PhD, and it was a place to make some money. I really didn't know anything about Korea. It was kind of I don't know, not a very well thought out decision, but it worked out very well. I enjoyed my time here. I actually ended up meeting my wife here, and we ended up moving back to
that first session in Korea.
In that first year, we met, got married, moved back to Canada very fast, and then I actually moved back to Korea in 2000, end of 2007, early 2008, to finish writing my dissertation, actually, because I had finished all the research, and I just needed to take a year off from teaching and just write. So we decided to come back here. My wife worked while I wrote. And then I got a job here in September. And then as I was finishing the dissertation and looking for positions in Canada and the U.S., I had this job, and then I've just sort of stayed here since. And now that I'm teaching media studies here at Kangwoon University, I'm sort of quite kind of content now to kind of do my research here, and especially with my interest in Hong, it's kind of worked out in terms of a transitioning from studying American cinema and Scorsese to studying Korean cinema in Hong Sangsoo.
How have your first impressions evolved since you first got here to Korea in a time, you haven't spent the whole time, obviously, as you say, since 2000 in Korea, but especially with that gap when you left for a while and came back, how has your view of Korea changed since you first saw it?
I think it's just become more kind of everyday, right? The more you kind of live in a culture, the less kind of foreign it ends up seeming to you. And I think you get more knowledge of the culture. You kind of, and not as if you recognize. It's not like saying, oh, this culture is the same as one I come from. Of course, it's not. It's got its own differences. But I think you understand the nuances of that difference more, as opposed to when you first come here, everything's just strange. Or it's like, why did they do it that way? Or what's weird? You're just this really kind of naive.
What seemed really different to you at first? Like, what was just one thing that jumped out at you that you were like, okay, that's how they do it here?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. I'm trying to kind of bring my brain back to...
Which is not how they did it in... You from Halifax?
Yeah, Halifax is where or Nova Scotia is where I grew up, yes. And, it's a good question. I think maybe one of the things you kind of recognize with where I worked at like a private institute here teaching English, and maybe how involved your employer was in your life in a way that Canada you don't really get, where
no drinking with your employer in Canada.
No, not only drinking with your employer, but yeah, they just seem to. Part of it wasn't only just being a foreigner, because as a foreigner, of course, they provide your housing and things like that, and they provide for you. But even the Korean teachers who are working there, I noticed the relationship between them was very, very different. Right? It had. There is this almost like a paternal attitude or maternal attitude, because my bosses were actually a husband and wife, and so
they were your parents then.
Yeah, they were my parents, the other teachers' parents, and
everyone's parents.
Yeah. So it had that vibe that I was not used to from work environments in Canada. That was very, very different, and so that was one thing that immediately sort of stress that came out, and then. The other things would be probably more kind of just superficial kind of things that you just kind of see, the social interactions, the kind of what I kind of saw as too much, and I still do to some extent, but too much reliance on authority, the kind of Confucian kind of thing that you hear talked about a lot. But I think that also gets kind of exaggerated as well. I think if you kind of examine it a bit more closely, it's much more complicated than just simply a hierarchy. There's just different kind of social rules that you have.
Lesson from Hong's movies: sometimes people do whatever they want.
Yeah. There is. That doesn't always kind of break down in those in that very schematic way, right? And it's something I've kind of bring back to Scorsese. That's one of the things I really disliked about a lot of Scorsese scholarship was the reduction of the films to the fact that Scorsese's Italian and he's Catholic. That's all we have to say about the movies. That explains everything. And I'm like, well, no, they're way more complicated than that. Surely, it's simply saying he's an Italian and a Catholic isn't enough. There's he's making these films for broader audiences, and these characters are interacting with a broader culture. And the same with Korea, right? Even if you want to say there's some pure Korean culture, which I don't think exists necessarily, it's changed itself dramatically over the years. Korean culture now is also interacting with globalization, the forces of globalization. So I don't see how you can kind of make any real blanket essentialist claims about Korean culture. But that's the tendency you have, I think, when you first come here, is to try to think of things in very black and white, us versus them terms. You live here longer, you become, even though you're always going to be, as you mentioned, a bit of an outsider to this culture, you become more of you get a little bit more inside it. Yeah.
Now, your book on Scorsese is called Hollywood's New Yorker, referencing the two most major cities in America, Los Angeles and New York. You now live in Korea. You write so much about Korean film. Were you always looking outward from Canada? Were you? It seems like you must have been fairly early.
Yeah, I mean, I've always one thing about Canada, if you're interested in cinema, and I didn't really get interested in film until I was in university. Weirdly enough, most big film fans or cinephiles start very young. I was really 18 or 19 before I got really interested in it. And the thing about Canada, especially from English language Canada, we have no popular cinema to speak of. Our popular cinema is Hollywood, as you know, to the extent that Hollywood includes us in their domestic gross, not in the international gross, right? Yeah, so it's so that was really the popular culture, the popular cinema that I got into was American cinema first, and then so that was. And so the idea of writing about Canadian cinema never really interested me. I mean, even though in Canada you do get Canadian cinema thrown at you quite a bit. If you take an introduction to film, for example, in Canada, you'll definitely get a section on Canadian cinema. They'll try to push it. But I just never had any real interest in it, especially when I was young. As I've gotten older, it's become a bit more, I've become more interested in it, read a bit more. But at the time, I kind of avoided Canadian cinema and really was focused on American. And specifically, once I got interested in Scorsese, that became really where my focus was going to be. So when I did my PhD and decided to write about Scorsese, that also led to doing comprehensive exams on American cinema and then as a lead-in. So that kind of became my specialty. And in terms of Korean cinema, that's been a bit more of I think just circumstantial in terms of living here a bit longer than I was originally expecting, and then becoming and becoming and I think I've been kind of lucky to see this Korean cinema has become a fairly big phenomenon over the last couple decades in the world. So there's been a lot of stuff to explore, a lot of writing on Korean cinema that kind of leads you into the cinema.
Are you ever asked by your students or Korean friends to sort of stand as a representative of your homeland, to be a Canada saram, to somehow explain to them where you come from and to I don't know, exude Canadian virtues, whatever they think those are?
Yeah, you get students come to you sometimes with I'm doing an assignment next week, Canada, in one of my classes. And then that's all they say, and you're kind of like, okay, you'll have to
good job.
You'll have to be a bit more specific than that if you need any help. But,
what do they want to know?
They don't. They just kind of just generally tell me about Canada. They don't really get very specific often. So you have to kind of. I'm not much of a nationalist myself, and I always kind of try to tell them. Well, it's very different than Korea. I mean, Canada's a very large country with very few people. It's spread over a very large distance. And I'm from Nova Scotia, for example. I have much more culturally in common with somebody from Maine than I do with somebody from British Columbia or Alberta, right? There's a much more, like when I read the novels of Stephen King, for example, I see a real strong similarity to where I come from.
The geography is similar there. It's not in the rest of Canada.
Right, the geography, and which maybe might influence like even the mentality of the characters, or I can really identify with it in a way that I I think maybe somebody from British Columbia would probably identify with maybe writers from the Pacific Northwest probably more than they would, maybe a Stephen King, right?
It's not a stark border between the States and Canada.
It is not. We share a language. We share, I mean, I always try to bring up, Quebec, because Quebec puts a totally different spin on it. We have this other kind of, Quebec, in many ways, Quebec is much more of a country or a nation.
Certainly, they sometimes actually try to become one.
They actually do, and I think it is more of a nation than the rest of English Canada is a nation, actually, right? And you can see that reflected. I tell them the story about the cinema as well. Quebec actually does have a popular cinema to the extent that, everyone in Korea knows Titanic. So I bring up the example that in 1997, Titanic was actually outgrossed in Quebec by this hockey comedy called Les Boys. Actually made more money in Quebec that year than Titanic did. And so,
have you seen Les Boys?
I have. It's as most lowbrow comedies go, it's hard to really translate exactly. Even as an English Canadian, I get maybe more of the jokes than maybe definitely a Korean would get, or an American even. But it's very specific. But it was a very, very popular kind of success. So Quebec's a whole different thing. So if you're talking about Canada, Canada is just, I think, in my opinion, I don't know, I haven't studied every country in the world. It's one of the least nationalistic countries in the world, where I find there are more nationalistic countries in Korea, I'm sure, but I think it's on the higher end of the scale.
What I've heard was, to the extent you can measure these things, you always see two countries, obviously there's two countries at the top too, but two countries at the top. Number 1, North Korea. Number 2, South Korea. These are the nationalistic countries. Then the other 193 are below. But what did it feel like to you to go from such a thinly populated, huge place to a thickly populated, relatively small place like Seoul?
I enjoy this, actually. I've always been somebody who likes cities, and even though
Halifax wasn't doing it for you?
Well, I actually grew up in a place called North Sydney, which has 8,000 people. So, and when I lived in the southern area of Seoul, actually kind of a suburb of Seoul called Gundang, and my apartment building there had more people than my hometown. It was a huge, a 4-apartment high-rise complex.
Those like a bunch of 24-story buildings?
Yeah. And so there was more people living in that apartment building, and you could fit my whole town in that apartment building. Which is a kind of a weird thing to kind of discover. When I discovered how many people lived in my apartment, I was really taken aback. But I really enjoyed it. I mean, it takes adjusting in terms of the crowds, and that does frustrate you, just as it frustrates, just being packed into a very condensed area can be frustrating. But I find I don't, especially with my current job or even the last few jobs I haven't had jobs where I've had to do the morning and the evening commute, where I do a 9 to 5 kind of job.
Line 2 in the morning commute, you will want to leave Korea right away.
Yeah, that's very very frustrating, and so I haven't really. So as long as I can have a job where I can avoid those kind of things, where I can pick and choose where I go and when. I really like living in a big city. There's just allows you to, maybe growing up in a small town and feeling very bored in that town, I really enjoy the city. So I've kind of worked my way up from Halifax, which was slightly bigger. I lived in Ottawa for about 10 years, which is slightly bigger. But then Seoul is extremely... And I think actually my wife experienced more of a culture shock moving to Ottawa from Seoul.
What did she think of Canada?
She just said, "Where are the people?"
Even in the States.
Yeah. She was like... Yeah, she was like, Ottawa's the capital city of Canada, right? It's it's got about 500,000 people, but it's very spread out. There's no crowds really.
Take her to Toronto?
Yeah, we went to Toronto. Even Toronto didn't feel overly crowded to her. Toronto's also fairly spread out. It's like this big urban sprawl.
They have a Koreatown, though, don't they? Or Korean people?
Yeah, they do have a Korea area around Bloor Street in Toronto, and. But yeah, she experienced it was much more shocking for her to go from Seoul to Ottawa, I think, than it was for me to come. Even though I did, certainly when I first arrived in Korea, I arrived on a really early morning, And actually, I was staying in the first year I lived here, I was in a really small town outside of just to the east of Seoul. And I remember I woke up at night, at 8 o'clock at night, and I looked at my hotel room, and I was shocked at how bright it was. The neon,
people are awake.
Yeah, the streets are just full, so bright. So that was a bit of a kind of a shock when I kind of woke up. Like, wow, even this small little town is like very vibrant.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked a lot about Hong Sangsoo, but are there any other filmmakers from Korea or Korean films that have really helped you understand life here or integrate in the culture?
That's a good question. The first Korean film I really remember loving is a movie called Oasis by Lee Chang-dong. And his films in general I really love. And Oasis identified with more in terms of the kind of social protest of that film and the anger of that film at Korean society. I mean, we talked about Hong Sangsoo's critiques. They're quite mild compared to Lee Chang-dong.
Many Korean filmmakers critique Korean society. I would say maybe most of them, even most of the mainstream ones.
Yeah, like Bong Joon-ho, Park Chan-wook, even you could see.
These big movies, The Host, Old Boy. I mean, they all have some element of looking back at Korea and finding fault.
Yeah, for sure. And then there's, but the film of Lee Chang-dong I really love is a film called Secret Sunshine, the one that's on critique, and that's the film I think that really tells you something about Korean society, and not simply, and I don't think it's simply, it's not as angry a film as his earlier work. It's much more observing about what happens when somebody from Seoul goes to this small town, what happens when this Korean idea of, you've heard of the term, of course, space. Okay, so what happens when you try to where you push that kind of concept too far? What happens in how does religion work in Korea, for example? What are the appeals to Christianity? What are its downfalls?
Why is it so popular?
I think there's just a lot in that film. And I think the fact that it is not set in Seoul, it's set in this smaller town,
It's actually named in Korean. It's just called the name of the town, Myeryang.
Myeryang, right? Yeah, which is I guess the kind of almost the nickname of the town, or the Secret Sunshine. But it's very very close to Busan in the kind of southern part, and so it's very considered like almost the countryside, even though I'm sure it's bigger than my hometown ever was, or probably bigger than Halifax. But it's I'm always shocked at when what Koreans consider a small town. Actually,
Well, everything but Seoul is a small town. That's the answer to that. Now, you've written about this film, Secret Sunshine, and how it uses melodrama, and it's funny because in every other country, I would say, when they make melodramatic movies, I'm sort of like, this is embarrassing to watch. Like, they're never effective. Even Japan, especially Japan, I would say, the melodrama they never pull it off. Somehow in Korea they do. How do they do it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's I guess it's hard to explain because they're in these melodramatic traditions are in a lot of popular cultures. They're certainly in Japanese popular culture as well, and so it's hard to trace it necessarily to Korean. This is just part of the Korean style, but Koreans do an interesting. Well, there's different types of melodrama. There's the really over-the-top housemaid variety melodrama, which I really like, but I think can turn off people, I think, to some degree. But the movies like Secret Sunshine or Christmas in August is another one I would think of.
That's a movie that turned many a Korean cinephile onto Korean cinema in the first place.
Right, yeah. And I think it's the combination of this kind of understated realism with the melodrama that affects people.
Grounded by realism.
Yeah, it has a certain grounding. So even though it's got these heavy emotional scenes, and scenes that even might seem over the top, they ultimately don't for some reason. They stay within the realm of, and yeah, I mean, I compare them to some of the best melodramas of Hollywood, which Hollywood is probably the cinema that does, other than Korea, that does melodrama the best.
Those days are long over, of course.
Yes, but if you look back to the 40s and 50s melodramas, and I think a lot of it too is, and I mean, as a cinephile, those are the films that really kind of shape what we think of as, especially if you're an auteurist, right? Like those are like, what people like Douglas Sirk or Maxwell Fools were able to do with these kind of very conventional melodramatic stories, how they were able to transform them through their visual style, is what people sort of identified as what a true director does. And I think that was what really turned me on to Secret Sunshine, was the fact that he was sort of using this more understated style, despite dealing with this very over-the-top kind of, the plot. If you describe the plot to somebody, it feels kind of very unrealistic or very oh, that's just a silly melodrama. But when you watch the film, it has a power that really overwhelms.
The reality of the film is greater than the concept of the film.
Yeah, and I think Lee Chang-dong does that with a lot of his movies, actually. Even something like Poetry has this very kind of scandalous subplot, but the way it's handled it doesn't come off that way. It comes off as...
You describe the movie, it seems over the top, but you watch it and it seems sort of well under the top. It's actually understated despite the sort of almost sensationalistic elements to it.
Yeah, and I think what Lee Chang-dong's an interesting kind of case, because he comes to cinema from literature. He was a novelist for the first part of his career, came to cinema quite late, and what is appealing to him about cinema is that he thinks it still has an audience, and that's why he wants to. So it makes sense that he would use these melodramatic forms, but at the same time, he obviously does not want to make simply a straightforward melodrama, cry, go home, that's it kind of movie. He wants to say something through the melodrama, and he's become very good at doing that. Unfortunately, he's not a director who works very often. He's only made... He and Hong debuted the same year, 1996. Hong Sangsoo has made 16 films. Each Dog has made 5. So.
He had to spend time as the culture minister, too, didn't he? Like, they made him be that. What does it say about Korea that they can just take an acclaimed director and say, be the culture minister, and he has to do it? Like, what's that about Korea?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if he... Did he... I haven't read that he had to do it.
I called it a bitter pill.
Bitter pill, yeah.
I'm just reading between the lines.
I think the whole Zhong concept, I don't really want to say yes, but I have to, yeah. Yeah, I think that's... definitely true. I think he did feel a very strong connection to that administration and to the president... President Ru, and so he was. I think what he says, that bitter pill. Yeah, he's like, I don't want to do it, but I feel like, if for the betterment of the country or for the betterment of Korean film, I should take this kind of on. And I think he is somebody who is also, like I mentioned, he actually quit being a novelist because he felt it was no longer it wasn't talking to anybody anymore. And he seems to now feel that way about cinema to some extent too. That even cinema he's not getting to anybody. So I think he goes through these kind of existential crises in terms of what purpose is my movie serve?
What's the form after this?
What's the form? Yeah. So he's I think there is, and I think he's just somebody who works kind of slower in general. So
does it make sense to ask the question, who is the Korean Martin Scorsese?
Oh, it's an interesting. I mean, the two that immediately pop to mind are Bong Joon-ho and Park Chan-wook. I think
most successful filmmakers.
The ones that have achieved some popularity, but also seem to be kind of outsider in terms of work. They seem to be doing their own thing. They're not
you wouldn't be saying like Kang Jae-gyu is Scorsese, because no, he's not. He's trying to make Hollywood movies.
Right. And I think also, I mean, Park Chan-wook, especially in the cinephilia, the intense cinephilia of Park Chan-wook, really relates to Scorsese's cinephilia. And so, I mean, that would be the director that would immediately kind of come to mind for me. And perhaps Bong Joon-ho as well, in terms of, even though Bong Joon-ho is always somebody who I felt a little bit more of the master kind of craftsman, like the kind of perfectionist, kind of has everything worked out, everything very clearly kind of defined. Park Chan-wook, I find a bit messier, more like Scorsese, like this kind of manic energy that's kind of going through the screen, but it's not always as kind of worked out or as
People debate whether some films are good.
Right, absolutely. I think Scorsese the same way. There's some Scorsese films that I think most people would acclaim as masterpieces, but others they don't quite work as well because he doesn't quite have control of the material. And I think Park Chan-wook, in a similar way, one can see that. Yeah.
Do you think Canada could use a Scorsese of its own?
Oh yeah, that'd be great, but I don't know. Well, there is a French-Canadian director, Denis Arcand, who has some similarities actually.
Really?
For example, well, this is a kind of a superficial one, but it's telling the year Scorsese makes Last Temptation of Christ in 1988. And Arcand makes Jesus of Montreal in 1989, and they're both Catholics. They both have this kind of critical relationship to. Both of them were declaimed blasphemous works that were the church condemned. And if you kind of look back at Arcand's earlier career, you can kind of see some of these kind of very harsh kind of critiques of kind of Quebecois society that Scorsese you could kind of see in some of his critiques of the new Hollywood work. And so yeah, there's
that's with the Koreans.
There's some of that with maybe somebody like Arcand, but yeah, it's definitely difficult to. I mean, without the kind of industry kind of support, we're probably better equipped at maybe creating, John Cassavetes kind of figures, but maybe not the Scorsese. Even though I guess David Cronenberg would be another one you could kind of think of. And that's somebody Scorsese also admires, and Scorsese's written kind of appreciations of as well.
Well, there was a time Korea had essentially no film infrastructure. It wasn't that long ago. Who knows, right?
Yeah, you never know. But without the benefit of language, it's very difficult, I think, for Canada to be able to. And I mean, I can't see a quota system ever getting by the MPAA. I don't think they would be too keen on that. So, yeah.
There are some obstacles, but nevertheless, listeners, you have a long list now of new directors, I hope, to check out. I've been speaking on this rainy day in Seoul, and Garosu-gil specifically, with Marc Raymond. He's an assistant professor at Kangwoon University. He is the author of Hollywood's New Yorker, The Making of Martin Scorsese, and he's written extensively about Korean film. Marc, thanks so much.
Thank you.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to all the backers of Notebook on Cities and Culture's Korea tour on Kickstarter. Adam Hartzell, Aidan Nullman, Alfred Lee, Andy Cooney, Angus Gordon, Bala Chenupati, Cam Smith, Chin Music Press, Dan Caraselli, Danny, Deborah Smith, Emmett Farragher, Umberto Grant, Ian Plosker, Ismail Kennedy, Jackie Gast, Jay Chang, Jeffrey Davis, James DeVito, Jonathan Filbert, Josh Paget, Kimberly Hahn, Manvir, Mark Hines, Matthew Workman, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Monica Eck, Michael Fransky, MJ Pritchett, Patrick O'Flaherty, Patrick Park, Piers Rippey, Robert Salzberg, Samuel Hansen, Sean Brown, Themistocles Crucis, Thomas Unterberger, Timothy Dobbs, and Wayne Wright.